Europe's Enron, the $18 billion dairy empire lie. Picture this. You're holding a carton of milk, the same brand your grandmother bought, the same logo you've trusted since childhood. Now imagine discovering that behind that familiar face lies one of the most audacious corporate frauds in European history. This is the story of Parmalat, Italy's beloved dairy giant that transformed from a small family business into a global empire worth $18 billion, only to collapse when investigators discovered that $5 billion of company assets existed nowhere but in the fevered imagination of its executives. When auditors called Bank of America in the Cayman Islands to verify Parmalat's claimed account balance of $4.9 billion in December 2003, the response was devastating. The account didn't exist, the documents were forgeries, and Europe was about to witness its own Enron moment. But unlike Enron's complex energy trading schemes, Parmalat's fraud was built on something beautifully simple yet horrifyingly vast. They simply lied about having money they never possessed, assets they never owned, and profits they never earned. The Parmalat story begins in 1961, when 22-year-old Calisto Tanzi inherited his family's small ham and preserves business in Collecchio, a quiet town near Parma, Italy. Tanzi, a college dropout with big dreams and an appetite for risk, pivoted the company into dairy products, launching Parmalat milk in distinctive Tetra Pak cartons that didn't require refrigeration. This innovation proved revolutionary for Italy, where many homes still lacked reliable refrigeration, and by 1966, Tanzi was selling his ultra-heat-treated milk across the country. The company went public in 1970, and Tanzi used the influx of capital to expand aggressively, acquiring dairy operations throughout Europe and South America. By the 1980s, Parmalat had grown from a regional Italian company into a multinational corporation with operations in 30 countries, owning everything from dairy farms in Brazil to food processing plants in Australia. Tanzi's empire included not just milk and yogurt, but also cookies, fruit juices, and even ownership of the Parma soccer team, making him one of Italy's most celebrated businessmen and a symbol of post-war Italian entrepreneurial success. However, beneath this impressive growth story, cracks began appearing as early as the 1980s, when Tanzi started using increasingly creative accounting methods to hide mounting losses and debt. The company's international expansion was expensive and poorly planned, with many foreign subsidiaries operating at significant losses that were masked through complex intercompany transactions and off-balance sheet financing arrangements. Tanzi discovered that by creating a web of offshore subsidiaries in tax havens like the Cayman Islands, Netherlands Antilles, and Luxembourg, he could shuffle money between entities, create fictitious transactions between related companies, and present a picture of profitability that existed only on paper. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. When Parmalat needed to show profits, subsidiary companies would purchase goods or services at inflated prices, creating artificial revenue streams that impressed investors and creditors. When cash was needed to service debt, Tanzi would simply create fake documents showing that offshore subsidiaries had deposited hundreds of millions of dollars into various bank accounts, providing temporary relief until the next crisis required an even larger fabrication. The fraud accelerated dramatically in the 1990s as Parmalat's legitimate operations continued hemorrhaging money, while Tanzi's appetite for expansion and personal enrichment grew exponentially. Between 1990 and 2003, the company raised over $6 billion through bond offerings, bank loans, and equity issuances, money that was supposedly funding profitable growth in emerging markets like Brazil and Argentina. In reality, vast sums were being diverted to other Tanzi family businesses, including travel companies, construction firms, and real estate ventures that had nothing to do with dairy products. Investigators later discovered that over $1 billion had been transferred to Tanzi-controlled entities through fictitious consulting agreements, inflated acquisition prices, and outright theft disguised as legitimate business expenses. The company's chief financial officer, Fausto Tona, became a master forger, creating fake bank statements, audit confirmations, and financial documents with such skill that even sophisticated international banks were deceived for years. Parmalat's auditors, Grant Thornton Spieh and later Deloitte and Touche, were fed a steady stream of falsified documents that showed healthy cash balances, profitable operations, and strong growth prospects, when the reality was mounting losses, depleted reserves, and an increasingly desperate scramble to keep the fraud alive. By the early 2000s, maintaining the illusion required ever more audacious lies and increasingly complex financial engineering that pushed the boundaries of credibility to their breaking point. Parmalat claimed to have accumulated massive cash reserves through its profitable South American operations, particularly in Brazil, where the company supposedly generated hundreds of millions in annual profits from dairy and beverage sales. These alleged profits were said to be held in various offshore accounts managed by subsidiary companies with names like Parmalat Financing Corporation, which claimed to have $4.9 billion deposited with Bank of America in the Cayman Islands. The beauty of this scheme was that it explained why Parmalat continued borrowing money despite supposedly having billions in cash. The money was trapped in offshore accounts due to currency controls, tax considerations, and complex regulatory requirements that made repatriation impossible. This narrative satisfied investors, creditors, and regulators for years, allowing Tanzi to continue raising fresh capital while secretly using new funds to pay interest on existing debts and finance his family's luxurious lifestyle. The company's annual reports became works of fiction, showing steady profit growth, strong cash generation, and a bright future for Italy's dairy champion, while internal documents revealed a company teetering on the edge of bankruptcy and sustained only by an ever-expanding web of lies. The beginning of the end came in late 2003, when Parmalat faced a liquidity crisis that couldn't be solved through more creative accounting or additional borrowing from deceived banks. The company needed to refinance $496 million in bonds that were coming due, but potential lenders were asking uncomfortable questions about Parmalat's claimed cash reserves and why a company with billions in the bank needed to borrow money at high interest rates. Tanzi and his conspirators decided to take their boldest step yet. They would prove their cash holdings by providing auditors with official bank confirmations from the Cayman Islands showing the exact balances held by Parmalat Financing Corporation. On December 8, 2003, Parmalat's auditors received what appeared to be an official letter from Bank of America confirming that Parmalat held $4.9 billion in a numbered account, complete with bank letterhead, authorized signatures, and all the formal elements of a legitimate financial document. However, when the auditors followed standard verification procedures and contacted Bank of America directly, they discovered that the entire document was a forgery. No such account existed. Parmalat was not a customer of the bank, and Parmalat had never deposited a single dollar with the institution. The revelation that nearly $5 billion in claimed assets was completely fictitious sent shockwaves through European financial markets and triggered a criminal investigation that would uncover the full scope of the fraud over the following months. Italian prosecutors, led by magistrate Enrico Chieri, began unraveling 14 years of systematic deception that had inflated Parmalat's assets by over $14 billion, while concealing debts that exceeded $8 billion. The investigation revealed that Tanzi had created a parallel universe of fake companies, fictional transactions, and forged documents so elaborate that it required a team of forensic accountants 18 months to fully map the extent of the deception. Beyond the non-existent Cayman Islands account, investigators discovered that Parmalat had claimed ownership of dairy operations that didn't exist, recorded sales to customers who had never heard of the company, and maintained fake receivables worth billions of dollars on its balance sheet. The company's supposedly profitable Brazilian operations were revealed to be massive loss makers that had been hemorrhaging cash for years, while the thriving European dairy business was actually struggling against fierce competition from larger rivals like Nestlé and Danone. As prosecutors dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that the fraud had corrupted not just Parmalat, but an entire ecosystem of banks, auditors, and financial institutions that had either been deceived by or actively participated in the scheme. Bank of America, Citigroup, and other major financial institutions had earned hundreds of millions in fees by helping Parmalat issue bonds and arrange loans, despite red flags that should have prompted more careful due diligence. The company's auditors faced intense scrutiny over their failure to detect fake documents and fictitious transactions, particularly Grant Thornton's Italian affiliate, which had signed off on financial statements that overstated assets by billions of dollars. Even more disturbing was the discovery that some banks and financial advisors may have known about irregularities but chose to ignore them because Parmalat was such a profitable client, generating enormous fees through constant refinancing and complex financial transactions. The scandal exposed fundamental weaknesses in European financial oversight, corporate governance standards, and the audit process that allowed a relatively simple fraud to grow into a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe affecting thousands of investors, employees, and creditors around the world. When Parmalat finally collapsed in December 2003, the fallout was immediate and devastating across multiple continents and financial markets. The company's bankruptcy wiped out 135,000 individual investors who had purchased Parmalat bonds, believing they were buying securities backed by a profitable, cash-rich corporation rather than worthless paper issued by an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Thousands of employees lost their jobs as dairy operations were shut down or sold to competitors, while pension funds and institutional investors faced massive losses that rippled through European financial markets. Calisto Tanzi was arrested and eventually sentenced to 18 years in prison after admitting to embezzling over $1 billion and orchestrating one of the largest corporate frauds in European history. His co-conspirators, including CFO Fausto Tona and other executives, received lengthy prison sentences, while several banks paid billions in settlements to defrauded investors and regulatory authorities. The scandal prompted sweeping reforms to European securities laws, audit standards, and corporate governance requirements designed to prevent future frauds of similar magnitude and complexity. The Parmalat collapse stands as a watershed moment in corporate crime history, demonstrating how a simple deception about having money in the bank could grow into an $18 billion fraud that fooled sophisticated investors, major banks, and international audit firms for over a decade. Unlike complex financial schemes involving derivatives, energy trading, or mortgage securities, Parmalat's crime was refreshingly straightforward. Tanzi and his accomplices simply lied about their company's financial condition on a massive scale, creating fake documents and fictitious transactions with such audacity and persistence that the business world believed their story long past the point where basic common sense should have exposed the truth. The scandal revealed that even in an era of sophisticated financial analysis and regulatory oversight, determined criminals could exploit the trust-based nature of global finance to perpetrate frauds of breathtaking scope and duration. Today, as you pass Parmalat products in European supermarkets, owned now by French food giant Lactalis, it's worth remembering that behind every corporate logo lies a story of human choices, and that sometimes those choices can transform a simple family dairy business into one of the most spectacular criminal enterprises in business history, proving once again that in the world of white-collar crime, the most effective lies are often the simplest ones, told with enough confidence and supporting documentation to make the impossible seem not just plausible, but profitable.